benefit, and would be some of the same benefit that we'd actually get from a single-payer system, is to standardize the billing system, to say that in Massachusetts, everybody uses one form to bill and to get paid. That will take costs out of the system right away. The federal government is already leading in that direction with HIPAA legislation that's been passed. We need to be a leader among states to do that. In addition to that, we need to have a comprehensive approach. Too often we look at the populations in segments. We need to understand everyone needs health care.
And the next question to you. Healthcare at the local level. Bruce, do you think it's possible to achieve a binding agreement between the people of Cape Ann and Northeast Health Systems that will protect the essential services at Addison Gilbert Hospital?
Well, I think it's necessary and it's desirable, and I think it is possible. One of the things that has been happening with Addison Gilbert Hospital over a very short period of time as hospitals go, the last 18 months, is that 18 months ago we thought that the hospital was in dire need of additional support and may have been facing closure. We don't think that today because we got into the trenches and pulled people together, developed a task force. We have different opinions on that task force, and that's one of the things I cherish about it. We get together and we try to do everything we can to support Addison Gilbert Hospital, to raise a different point of view when we need to. Now, as for a binding agreement, one of the best ways to do that is a determination of need process. Up until now, the things that have been done at the hospital have not required a determination of need. Representative Verga and Mayor Bell and I have been very aggressive in communicating with DPH on that very issue. However, as you may have read in the newspapers, recently Beverly Hospital announced that it was going to complete or begin a $50 million renovation at Beverly campus. And the threshold in order to trigger a DON is far in excess of that. And I expect that it's far less than that. And I expect at the next task force meeting, or maybe perhaps the meeting after that, we are going to discuss how to aggressively pursue that, particularly working with some legal experts that we've been able to benefit from in the city of Lynn, who have been working with the Lynn Community Task Force with other issues in a similar way to keep a community hospital open. I think the answer is yes. I think we should do it. But I would also say this. In the absence of an agreement, I think it's incumbent on the leadership of Northeast Health Systems to come to the table and address this community directly. We have stood in support of the hospital. We've produced resources for the hospital. And I'll admit, we've made a lot of progress to the extent we're now seeing investment, we're seeing new services. But communication with this community is essential, and it's something that I will not stop fighting for each and every day. We don't get a lot of cooperation. That doesn't mean we'll stop.
Paul, your comments?
Well, I agree that a binding agreement is something to be sought after. Frankly, I think, though, the senator did very good work in forming the task force and making it a sounding board for opinion. He missed an opportunity when the state money was handed out to Northeast Health Systems, two $500,000 checks to keep, ostensibly to keep Addison Gilbert running. There was a time, as the senator said, they've been very uncooperative. We haven't been able to look in their books, although they plead poverty a lot. What we could have done, he was the man standing there with the $500,000 check. He was the guy with the hammer in his hand. He could have insisted that Stephen Laverty open the books of Northeast Health System. He didn't do that. It was an opportunity that was lost. And we would know at least where things stood financially, and that would give us some view into the future.
And the question is to you, Paul. Federal and state mandates for reform of the public school system present a complex challenge to cities and towns. We're all aware of that. You've touched on it, actually, in your earlier comments. And with, in fact, the systemic difficulties in managing the implementation, as well as the lack of funding and flawed formulas of distribution, it does appear that students could be, unfortunately, at the mercy of the very legislators who are trying so hard to help them. It would be difficult for legislators to support formula changes that would move money out of their districts as this process starts in the next year or two. What do you think should be done and how?
I think we need to go to a base level of funding that is done on a per-child basis, just per child, regardless of income, and ensures that there's a fundamental floor, a foundation on which every child's education is built. And that formula can be, we can thrash that out as part of the legislative process. That's important. But we also need to recognize that the aid formula is flawed and does favor does penalize cities and towns which have arbitrarily high property values. I think we do have to address that. I hope as part of the majority party in the Senate that I might have more success than the senator has had in addressing that issue.
Your response.
And one of the great things about the Senate is many times we work together. And one of the great things about the relationship that I have with the Senate President and the Senate Chair of Ways and Means is that we've been able to work together and recognize the problems that you just described. That's why we have a bill that begins to fundamentally change Chapter 70, because we've been able to collaborate, because we understand that if we don't do that, we don't get the results that people deserve and expect from us as legislators. We don't put ourselves in silos and based on party. We reach out and we have the beginning of a great piece of legislation. It's not perfect. It's not perfect. And I also want to point out that Northeast Health Systems does report much of its data to DPH in healthcare finance and policy, and I also have a letter from Stephen Laverty guaranteeing us that he will maintain essential services at the hospital. Is anything a firm guarantee? It's not. Did we have that letter 18 months ago? We didn't.
Thank you. And the next question is to you, Bruce. In an in-depth review of Chapter 40B, an accomplishment, Chapter 40B review was accomplished and delivered in May of '03 by the Governor's Task Force on 40B. Why, almost 18 months later, has the legislature, in your opinion, failed to implement any of the unanimously endorsed recommendations?
Jen, it's a great question. I served on that task force and helped to put those recommendations together. I serve on the Committee on Housing and Urban Development, which reported out that bill. I worked with my colleagues, in particular Senator Chandler, who has had a tremendous amount of experience and insight into this particular issue. We worked hand in hand to produce those recommendations that became that bill. Unfortunately, in the House, there was a tremendous amount of resistance to passing a Chapter 40B reform bill. Now, the resistance came in different forms, but one of the most pronounced was a group of legislators who wanted to repeal Chapter 40B completely. Because that held up the process for so very long, the Senate didn't receive that bill until the last days of the session to be able to act on. We worked very hard to try to bring it to the forefront, and I'm confident that Senator Chandler and I and many others in the Senate will be ready to move that bill forward in substantial form in the next legislative session. Sometimes issues like this take incredible amounts of time. The Community Preservation Act, the Rivers Protection Act, but it takes persistence to get it done. We've had that kind of persistence. We're going to have that kind of persistence, and I seriously believe that we will make reforms to Chapter 40B that make sense, that help communities, but that don't retreat from our fundamental obligation to try to develop affordable housing. We all know we need affordable housing in this Commonwealth, and particularly in eastern Massachusetts. But I also believe that cities and towns should have the ability to control their own destiny. They shouldn't be overridden easily by the state, and they shouldn't be faced with the prospect of having the character of a community changed by people who aren't in that community, but who are on a housing appeals committee that's inside of DHCD. So I think we can make changes. I don't think the prospect of repealing Chapter 40B is realistic. I think the prospect of fundamentally changing it is on the table. I've helped to bring it to that process, to that point, and I want to go back to put it over the goal line.
Thank you. Paul, your thoughts on 40B reform?
Well, as I go around the district, one question that I hear from everybody is, how are my kids going to break into a $400,000 housing market? How can that happen? So we definitely need some method of producing affordable, what I call entry-level housing. I think 40B is a bit of a meat axe. I think it does need to be reformed. I think that one of the key reforms might be to up the ante for the developers. Right now, up till now, it's been a tool that developers can use to override local authority. I would raise the ante. I'd make them put 50%, for example, of the housing units in any project have to be deemed affordable by whatever standard we choose to use at the time, so that in return for the profits that they reap, they make a substantial investment in the community as well, and in that entry-level housing. This would have the additional effect of helping to revitalize some of our inner cities, some of the Gloucesters and the Ipswiches and the Wilmingtons, where there is an infrastructure and a transportation infrastructure which can serve this entry-level housing.
Thank you. And the question is to you, Paul. Last week, federal, state, and local authorities intercepted fishing boats in Gloucester Harbor and returned them to port, where vessels and crews were searched and questioned. Critics, including Mayor Bell and fishing industry advocates, questioned the need and extent of the operation and decried the lack of community knowledge or involvement. What was this sweep of the fleet about?
Well, it presumably was Amendment 13 stuff. They were making sure that they weren't using illegal trawls or illegal gear. It did strike me as a little over the top, frankly. So, was it legal? I'm sure it was. Was it good judgment? Probably not.
Jen, unfortunately, it was a little bit more difficult than that because, as Paul would indicate, the actions were taken under the guise, in many respects, of fisheries regulation, but in fact what was taking place was a search for illegal immigrants and other kinds of issues that ran much deeper than fisheries regulations. And one of the reasons that people are very upset is that fisheries regulators and fisheries enforcement agents, as you may know, have very sweeping powers. And the reason they have very sweeping powers is because the ability at sea to conceal evidence or to throw it overboard, as the case may be. And so the powers of search and seizure of a Coast Guard person acting as a federal fisheries law enforcement agent or as a federal fisheries law enforcement agent acting on their own behalf are very, very broad. And one of the things that upset people in this community is the fact that those things were used as a guide to go in and search for people that had issues with immigration and perhaps illegal drug trafficking and some other things. We walk a fine line with this issue. We need to have public safety. We need to be protected from terrorism. We need to be protected from influences that we don't want coming into our community that may be a terrorist threat. But at the same time, we live in America, and we need to strike a balance between what's happening in terms of law enforcement and our rights as individuals. I know that Mayor Bell is taking action to try to get into this situation, and I'll stand by him to try to unravel it.
Thank you. The question is to you, Bruce. What statewide issues will be the biggest challenge for you in 05-06?
I don't think there's any doubt that one of the biggest issues is going to be trying to deal with the state budget. The Mass Taxpayers Foundation has indicated that we still have some structural problems with the budget. One of them, Jen, is clearly the Medicaid situation. If you look at health care spending and human service spending and you take them together as a portion of the state budget, it's over 40%. And a significant percentage of that is health care. And so trying to understand how we can make changes so that we can keep that budget under control while still providing essential services is certainly going to be a challenge. I've articulated to the leadership in the Senate and the House that I think it's one of the biggest challenges that we face. We want to provide care to people, but we also need to find some ways to better manage that care, and I think we can do it. I think in addition to that, we are going to deal with education. There is a decision, as has been mentioned before, the Supreme Judicial Court. Judge Botsford has recommended that something needs to change with education funding in Massachusetts. That decision has the potential to have serious impacts on the state budget to the tune of billions of dollars. I think we can work to avoid that impact depending on what the decision of the court is. One of the ways that we can do it is to make sure our money is spent better. There's no question we could probably raise the foundation budget for every community and raise that level. But there's also an issue of leadership in our schools and how that money is spent. There are people that are very ingenuitive on Cape Ann that are already working on ways to provide better leadership in the communities that need that targeted spending. But it's going to be an issue. We also, as we've already talked about, we need to reform the fundamental formulas by which aid is shared to cities and towns. It appears that if things go well, and we all hope they do, it appears that we're going to have an opportunity to have some additional resources to look at those formulas. And when we do, it's going to be a challenge. That's why I've organized with my two colleagues, one in the House and one in the Senate, both representing Lynn, Senator McGee and Representative Fennell, the Northeast Legislative Caucus, which are legislators from the North Shore and the Merrimack Valley working together to be a stronger force in those kinds of reforms.
Thank you.
Well, I agree with healthcare and education are the two big issues that we have to face. But there's a larger issue, too. You can't have it both ways. If you want these things, if you want, as I do, universal access to health care, and if you want every child in the Commonwealth to have access to a top-flight education at all levels through the university, you've got to be straight with people. You can't tell them, as the governor does, and as the senator supported in 2000, we'll cut all these taxes and you can have it anyway. Those two things simply don't work together. We have to be straight with people and say, if you want this, if you want that, this is the cost, and we think it's worth paying for.
The next question to you, Paul.